This is Jacs Facts, connecting the Jackson Catholic schools with the greater community. Jacs Facts is the program informing you of all the goings-on within the Catholic schools. Jacs Facts is locally produced and is an exclusive production of Good Shepherd Catholic Radio in Jackson, Michigan. And now, it's time for Jacs Facts.
You're listening to Good Shepherd Catholic Radio. I'm Lucian Leone, and my guest today is, he's one of my best friends, one of my favorite guests to have on the show, Dr. Robert Moore Jumonville. I'll get that right one of these days. I just prefer Dr. Mojo.
I always say, with a name like that, we deserve whatever we get.
Yeah, that's true. Well, thanks for being my guest again.
Happy anytime. It's delightful.
Well, and it's really, I almost feel kind of ashamed to call you a guest because with all your work, especially on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you're kind of like really more of a co-host with this whole, in all of this endeavors.
Maybe someday.
Yeah.
I'm an aspiring voice.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, there's a lot we could talk about. And that, as I was just chatting with Dr. Mojo before we came on the air, I was just saying one of the things I just so appreciate is, and we actually are going to talk, we'll probably do it in a future episode, is just talking about the role of friendship and kind of what a difference that makes in our faith. But that's really for a future episode.
Right.
What I wanted to start with is those of you in the Jackson community, some of you may have attended an event we had recently, which was on Wednesday, April 18th. And the diocese actually set this up. They invited Tim Francis in, and he has a whole event that's all on Eucharistic miracles. And he brings in a whole bunch of posters, and so you can see throughout the centuries. But the main part of the event is his talk, and he went to not only Lumen Christi, but all that week he was at Gabriel Richard in Ann Arbor. He was up in Flint at Powers, and he was also at Lansing Catholic in Lansing.
Yeah, I think that he's actually. I was trying to look something up. I think that not him, but there's some Eucharistic encounter at St. John's this Sunday. So that's at 7 p.m. Kathy Blanchard had mentioned it.
Yeah, that's right.
Who's working with families there, and it's a Eucharistic encounter for youth. So
yep.
I just mentioned that because that's April 23rd, right? Is that this?
That's coming up on the 23rd, which by the time this episode airs, will have gone by.
Oh, we will. Okay. This is the 21st, so this okay.
So yeah, this won't air anyway. I'm going to probably cut this whole part out.
Okay, good.
Because it'll be in the past.
Right.
All right. So in any event, so Tim Francis came in and he talked about Eucharistic miracles, and he showed a kind of he kind of showed snippets of a documentary about, especially focusing on Gladys Quiroga de Mata, who is an Argentinian woman who has had the stigmata that it actually comes and it goes on certain days. And that was, to me, fascinating. I had known nothing about her.
Yeah, I hadn't either. Yeah.
And I mean, he did talk about Padre Pio and some of the other more well-known stigmatists. But anyway, so that he showed that. And he just talked about the role of the Eucharist in our faith and kind of in his life and his conversion story. And then there was a short time for Eucharistic adoration. And in the morning, there was a time for the middle school students. In the afternoon, a time for the high school students. And in the evening, that was the more extended presentation. That was really for the adults in the community.
So if I could describe, too, so like what the day was like for the theology students, there, if you can imagine an easel that's fairly tall, like what you'd see like a poster board being on. There were 46 of these that were lining the Lumen Christi track in the gym, and theology classes were invited to bring their students down and to walk through these. And we had an assignment with that, asking them what were the similarities, what were the differences, because there were a lot of themes. What was the span of years? Because they spanned from 750 to 2008, these Eucharistic miracles. And so it was very interesting because any of our listeners realize we're not a school that is solely Catholic in student body. We have some students coming who are Protestant and some students coming who are like what would be called nuns. They just, they're just coming here because of the education, not because of any kind of religious affiliation. So to get that kind of exposure to Eucharistic miracles and this deeper understanding of maybe like what the Eucharist is, that was really great for our students.
Well, and I would love, Dr. Mojo, for you to just chat about what were some of the comments, kind of after the fact when you were reflecting with the students on that. And I would love to hear both if there were differences between what some of the Catholic students how they might have responded to it, and some of the non-Catholic students. Because I was talking to Father Brian earlier, and he said, because I asked him the same question. I said, so how did the students seem to kind of process all of that in the presentation? And he said, well, from his, he hadn't had any kind of clear conversations just because he hasn't had a lot of chance to talk about it with the students since it happened. But he said, in his sense, it's kind of like Catholic Disneyland. It's like you kind of get this very intense experience, something that's, for us Catholics, the source and summit of our faith is the Eucharist, and all of this surrounds that. But for somebody for whom that isn't kind of their background and experience, it can be a little bit different.
Right, yeah. It can be off-putting, possibly.
Yeah.
Well, so for my students, and I can only speak for I have the sophomores and the seniors, I had tried to set them up for success rather than failure. And so one of the things that I did, I told them that I grew up not in the church, not believing. And then I said, okay, what we're talking about here is miracles. So everybody get out a catechism, and we have a bookshelf of catechisms in the classroom. And so I said, BYOCCC, bring your own, get out of your chair and get your catechism. Don't get one for your partner because you'll deprive them of the ability to get off their fanny right now. And so I said, okay, look in the index and automatic A for the first student who finds miracle. And they're looking, and some of the slower students, were really fast. They wanted that automatic A. Miracle is not one of the listings in the index. And you have to, if you're going to look at miracle in the catechism, you've really got to look between the lines. There's kingdom signs that come under the life of Jesus. And then early on, this would be this is 800 pages and no major section on miracles.
Yeah.
But there's a small paragraph, it's paragraph 67, that talks about private revelations. Now, so these would be Marian apparitions, and they would be Eucharistic miracles, which is really interesting. And I wanted students to know, because some of these sound like legend, or they sound overstated or something. They sound too big for truth. And so I wanted them to recognize that this is in the realm of devotion. And if it helps you, yes. And you're going to be drawn to some of these more than others. That's what you need to think about. But it's not something that the church requires. Our Mother of Guadalupe, that's something that the church has attested to. It affirms, has confirmed and says, this is really helpful, but still that's private revelation.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, I didn't have a lot of students at the end protesting, saying this was all bunk. And they were interested.
Yeah.
They really were, because some of them, can I just say some of the themes?
Of course, yeah.
Some of the themes were like the Eucharist, the consecrated host unknowingly falls on the ground, and it leaves an imprint on marble. So the Eucharist is in a monstrance, and there's a fire, and everything is burned except the Eucharist. And there were several where the Eucharist, the consecrated host, was preserved through fire, where it would levitate.
Yeah. Yep.
Where someone would steal it or it was misplaced, and then miraculously the Eucharist made itself known through glowing or through, and then the comment that I got most back, I said, well, what were some of the themes? And students in every section of my classes said unbelief. And so there was this theme of a priest of all people, right? Saying like, I was doubting that this was the real body, the real presence. And suddenly the host began to bleed. Yeah. And then it was on the corporal, on the, what sits down below the chalice at the altar on that piece of cloth, and actually some of those then were tested later, and it ends up being human blood.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think overall that was that the students responded positively and very interested in, what I would say in 46 of them, they thought, yeah, this was quite compelling and very interesting.
That, and what I found very inspiring was the presenter, Tim Francis. He had a very kind of direct, matter-of-fact way of kind of presenting the material. You never got the sense that he was trying to convince anybody of anything.
Not a salesman.
Yeah. He was not trying to sell anyone.
Yeah.
He told his personal story, and it was quite inspiring to think, a bouncer at a bar down in Columbus and just kind of living a fairly typical.
Even though he went to Ohio State,
we
forgave him.
Yeah, we forgave him for that. But he just kind of presented that, and he said, and then his life was changed kind of when he had exposure to the amazing miracles that have happened throughout the centuries, and it really kind of transformed his life.
Right.
And I would love to just get your perspective as a former Protestant minister and a fairly recent, that is 2019, convert to the Catholic faith. Kind of how, maybe I would love you to kind of unpack or just talk a little bit about for our listeners, what might have been your thinking about it before you became a convert, and how the Eucharist might have influenced your decision to become a Catholic, and kind of how that presentation today kind of.
We'll see how far we get.
Okay, we'll see where that we can go.
We'll start with go back 10 years, and this actually came up in class today because what I showed as a follow-up to this was a 35-minute documentary on Blessed Carlos Acutis, who died, I believe, when he was 17. So he died in 2006 of leukemia and very short illness and died right away. But he was, I think, the first person to put together a display of Eucharistic miracles. And Pope Francis has kind of put him forward as like the blessed, the saint. He's not a saint quite yet, right? But the patron saint of the internet, because early on he was studying all of these Eucharistic miracles. He would go to sites, he would take pictures, and putting together kind of like what we saw on poster board here, these Eucharistic miracles. So watching that, and then watching also through this documentary, the process of canonization of Blessed Carlo, and that would 10 years ago would have just seemed like you mentioned, Father Brian mentioned Disneyland. It would have seemed like so much extra other than the Bible, things that were put on here, like saints and these miracles and the process of how the church entombs the saints and venerates the Eucharist and all. It would have seemed like overboard. As I was trying to tell the students about this too, I remember a friend of mine, and I think he was Orthodox, he wasn't Catholic, but he asked me a question that really stuck. He said, "What's the difference between a big miracle and a small miracle?" And it's like, he said, "Do you believe in the resurrection?" It's like, well, yeah, of course I do, right? And so what's the difference, between that? Which one's easier? In a sense, it's almost like Jesus' question, what's easier to say, take up your pallet and walk, or your sins are forgiven.
Right.
And so it made me realize that if I'm affirming the reality of these small miracles present in our time right now, basically what I'm saying is our universe is not just what we can touch, taste, see, smell. It's not this empiricism that we're so bought into through medicine and science, but it's like maybe it's more permeable to the spiritual world, right? So, and then why not have these miracles confirm faith and help encourage us, So I think I want to come back as somebody who's teaching, to say the primary goal, and this is, this is not just my Protestant background, but the primary goal is to bring us to Jesus Christ.
Right.
And that's, as I've been teaching the catechism, you see that the catechism is so Christocentric.
Yep.
And as you look at church history, it's all so Christocentric. Right? So it's like, I would counsel, in fact, I just recently did counsel a student of mine who had been received at St. John's at the Easter Vigil. I said, look, if it helps bring you to Jesus, that's good. If it doesn't, just set it aside and it'll catch up with you in a few years.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh, that's great. And I love the way that you've kind of connected that for the students with Blessed Carlos Acutis. Is it Carlos Acutis? Is that how you pronounce it?
I think so. Acutis.
And I know
there's good YouTubes on him.
That's great, because that's something I'm going to definitely be watching. Because another Italian. It's always nice. A young Italian.
Yeah.
He died of, was it leukemia or something like that at a very early age. It's so inspiring, frankly, that because when we hear about these, the stories of these young martyrs to the faith, they're typically back in the 300s or the 400s or whatever.
Right.
But this is a young man who was so on fire for God. In the 21st century.
Right. And so we started this conversation talking about friendship.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I asked my students was, as you're going to watch, set them up, I'm going to show you this video. As you watch this documentary, think about whether if this kid were at Lumen Christi, would he be a dork? Would he be somebody that you're trying to, avoid in the hallway? Or is he somebody who's like, this kid's pretty cool, And so you see him like making faces in the camera when he's like in junior high with his friends. He's just like a normal kid, but he had a heart for the poor. He had such integrity that he just like if somebody gave him too much change back, when he bought ice cream, he'd race all the way back through his EC and find the vendor, and give him the correct change back. And so at the end of the video, it's like, isn't this kind of sort of like the definition of a saint? Is that you look at their life and you say like, wow, I would like to hang out with that guy. Yeah, he'd be a pretty cool person, because that those friends, right, are the ones that bring out your best self.
Yeah,
they make you a better you.
Yeah. Oh, and let's chat about that a little bit, about this whole theme of friendship, because it's something that we both, I think, appreciate, is the impact of friendship on faith and kind of growing in faith. And I know I can say not only your friendship, but the thing that's been transformative in my life up in East Lansing at our parish is 4 years ago, we were asked to start a faith sharing group. And so we, my wife was kind of reluctant, because she said, my life is too busy. I don't want to do it. And I said, we have to do this. And then she got on board. And we started, I think it was Advent 4 years ago, or Lent 4 years ago. And since then, and we basically we had a table at the back of the church, and we just invited people up, and people we didn't know. So a couple folks, we ended up inviting our people that were our friends a little bit, and we invited. But one of the couple they're from Burkina Faso. They've been living in this country for 30 plus years. But they said, oh, sure, we'll join the group. And they are now we have a group of about 14 or 15. We meet on Sundays during Advent and Lent, and we always kind of will study a book. And we did one by Edward Sri on the Passion, which was outstanding for Lent. But what's so cool is these 15 people have just now become great friends. And so it started as a faith sharing group, but it really became friends. And now we just support each other in living our Christian life. And what's so amazing is when there was a couple people have joined recently because they just wanted to be in a group where they could have some support.
Yeah.
And so we're getting people that they're at all different places, but basically I almost don't even want to call it a faith sharing group. I really just want to call it a group of friends.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good image of the body of Christ.
Yes.
As we've been doing Catechism in a year, it's right now, Father Mike Schmitz is talking about the church, and that sense that it is this, you love what Christ loved, and Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it. I think too, for all my Protestant friends out there, this is what was so important in the Reformation, it was so important for John Wesley, was the small group.
Yeah.
And, so you have these connections like with Luther, and, some of the Melanchthon, some of the fellow ministers that he worked with, and same with Calvin in Geneva, but Wesley particularly focused on the small group.
Yep.
And they would ask these questions like, what sins have you committed since the last time we met? They were very serious about not just having a potluck, which is great. Fellowship is great, but really concerned about the deeper things of one's soul.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's like, in one sense, that's like the heart of the church, right? Is like the small group. The question will be for you guys, I think, is when you get too big, right? Because at a certain point, you can't have a small group of 30.
Right.
Yeah. And so you may end up having to split.
Well, and that was it's interesting you say that, because I was just having that conversation with my wife the other day, and I said, yeah, because we're about 13 to 15 right now, and we just realized that's kind of like the maximum size that works.
Jesus had 12 disciples.
Exactly. And because you get much bigger than that, and then it's hard for people to share. It's just really hard for that dynamic to happen. And I said, yeah, we might have to split at some point. And Bernadette said, there is no way we're ever splitting this group because these are just my friends.
Right.
And
it's interesting because there is a certain dynamic here, because you don't want to say, no, you can't come into the group either, right? And so it's gonna naturally attract people because the Spirit of God is there.
Yeah.
And people are attracted to the faith. So I'm thinking too, like, to be a part of that small group, now all of a sudden what hasn't been evident at the start was when someone goes through a crisis, they're not alone.
Right.
Now all of a sudden there's, and it's the kind of thing where it's like, you live close enough to someone. It's like, hey, my car broke down. Can you pick me? There are people around to support you in the everyday life. Or I'm struggling because my daughter has, or my son is off doing this. Give me some advice. It's a wonderful place to have support.
Yeah.
And to think, especially in this post-COVID era, where we've been more and more isolated in the cell phone era.
Yeah. Well, and just to your point, just recently, my oldest son lives in Columbus, Ohio, and he works in a company that does kind of construction related work. And one of my faith sharing group friends, his son has just moved to Columbus because he's engaged. Well, actually, he just moved back to Columbus. He had lived somewhere else, but he's looking for a job. Yeah. And he reached out to me and said, oh, do you have any way you could help my son get a job? Yeah. And Nick was glad to kind of connect with him, and he's trying to make some connections, which will help him get a job. And I just thought, this is the power of friends. You just support each other in living a good life. Yeah. And I really do think, because Catholic, in the Catholic Church, we do. I think we have a sense of the domestic church, i.e. the family, and we have a sense of the parish and what that's supposed to be.
Right.
But we have never had a focus on the value of small groups. Right. And I think it's really been, in essence, a lack that is so critical. Yeah. That I'm excited that more and more parishes are realizing this is an absolutely kind of critical level of subsidiarity in terms of building a vibrant Christian life. Yeah,
and some of these verses, like Jesus saying, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am in the midst." Yeah, it is that sense that 2 or 3, we can have these conversations. When the parish, when you get there, you're focused on Mass, and you don't have much time to talk, really. So, can we bring it back to Eucharist?
Well, I was going to do that because obviously, it's called communion, and I was and you were probably going to say the same thing, but I was just thinking of, we call it communion. It's supposed to be the common meal, and the whole idea that when we think about the Eucharist, we end up thinking about us and God. But when you look at Holy Thursday and the whole everything about the Eucharist is, and we just been hearing the readings of the multiplication of the loaves. Right. In every sense, when Jesus is talking about the Eucharist, it's the idea of, it's not just take and eat by myself, yourself, but do this together.
Right.
Anyway, what would
no, and I was just thinking too, is coming back to this question of the miraculous.
Yeah.
I think just for all of us listening, and I'm including myself and you in this too, Lucien, that to think about the world that we live in and where is the miraculous, and how can we train our eyes to see the miraculous? Because to say God became human, the nativity is a miracle. It's a miracle it's such a mystery that we can't quite fathom it. And the Eucharist is the same thing. And,
yes.
and I don't know, you've said this before, it's like it ought to just make us more in awe every time we come to receive the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist, that this is something that we can't quite fathom, but we ought to treat it with such with such dignity, with such joy.
Yeah.
But then also just to think about like how it's not these little boxes that miracles happen in.
Right.
But that actually it's now encouraging us to then like, and I don't want to just make it a metaphor, but to become Eucharist, to be broken for the world, to be filled with the Spirit in these small groups, etc.
Yeah.
We see it happening everywhere.
Wow. There's so much more we can talk about here, Dr. Mojo, but it's going to have to be for a future segment of Jacs Facts or whatever. But it's been so good to have you as my guest today. You've been listening to Jacs Facts. I'm Lucien Leone. My guest today has been Dr. Robert Moore Jumonville. Thanks for listening. God bless.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Jacs Facts, an exclusive local production of Good Shepherd Catholic Radio in Jackson, Michigan. To hear a replay of this episode or for more information, please see the Good Shepherd Catholic Radio website at gscr.org.